to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I'll be talking to Susan Abernethy about Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II. Susan's passion for history dates back 50 years and led her to study for a Bachelor of Arts degree in history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She's currently a member of the Rocky Mountain Medieval and Renaissance Association, the Historical Writers Association, the Society for Renaissance Studies, and the Historical Association. Her work has appeared on several historical websites and in magazines and includes guest appearances on historical podcasts and YouTube videos. Her blog, The Freelance History Writer, has continuously published over 500 historical articles since 2012, with an emphasis on European, Tudor, medieval, Renaissance, early modern, and women's history. Her second book, The Formidable Women Who Shaped Medieval Europe, Power and Patronage in the Burgundian Court, will be released in October 2025, and she's currently working on her third non-fiction book. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Susan. How are you?
Good. How are you, Jess?
I'm wonderful, thank you. I'm so excited for today. We're talking about Catherine of Braganza, a woman that's been a subject of one of your books. But first, I thought we could talk a little bit about you, and I was wondering if you could tell us about yourself and your background.
Sure. My interest in history is over 50 years old. I started reading books when I was young, and then there was a TV series back on way back in the early 70s, The Six Wives of Henry VIII, and I watched that, and I just was floored. I couldn't believe it. Truth was better than fiction to me. And so I started reading more and more and more. I would go to the library and check out books. There was a writer named Jean Plady. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she used to write historical fiction about British history. And she actually wrote a book about Catherine called The Merry Monarch's Wife. So I read that a long time ago. And then when I started my blog, The Freelance History Writer, in 2012, I decided I was going to do an article on every queen of England. And I did some research on Catherine. And I noticed that there just wasn't a lot of information when I was looking. And it turned out that most of the books that had been written about her were fairly old. And I'm talking about books in English. Of course, there were some in Portuguese, and so I thought she would be a good subject to write about.
I agree. I think Catherine of Braganza gets quite forgotten, especially in English history, because obviously, as you say, you've got the Six Wives of Henry VIII, and then, especially for English history, it just seems to be Six Wives of Henry VIII, and then they go straight to Victoria. Six Wives, Elizabeth I, and then it's Queen Victoria, and that seems to be it. Especially growing up, I was like, who's Catherine of Braganza? I've never heard of her.
And yes, and you're right about her being forgotten. I think that you can find all these books about the glamorous mistresses of King Charles, but you just don't see that much about her. And you think of her as being kind of in the background and being depressed and angry, and it really isn't true. It just isn't true.
So on to Catherine herself. When and where was Catherine born, and who were her parents?
Okay, but at the time that Catherine was born, her father was the eighth Duke of Braganza, and he was a descendant of an illegitimate child of King John the First from back in the 14th century. So he did have a claim to the throne. But at that point, he was just the most powerful and the most wealthy duke in Portugal. And Spain at the time was being ruled, or Portugal at the time was being ruled by Spain. And at that at that point, the people were starting to rebel against the Spanish rule, and they were thinking about restoring the Portuguese king. And they asked Catherine's father, who was living in Villa Vicosa, which is just to the west of Lisbon, in his beautiful palace, if he would be king. And at first he said no, but his wife said, yes, I think we should do this. So Catherine was born in Villa Vicosa. It was before her father became king. When she was 2 years old, they had a big birthday party at the palace. And many, many people came. And part of that was a meeting to talk her father into becoming king. And so he finally agreed. And then a few weeks later, there was like a bloodless coup in Lisbon. And her father was proclaimed king. So he was King John IV of Portugal. And his wife was Luisa Maria Francisca de Guzman. She was the daughter of a Spanish nobleman. And at that time, her mother decided to give Catherine a convent education. And we don't really know which convent, and we don't know if the nuns came to the palace or if they took her there or how that worked, but she did get taught by the nuns. Of course, it wasn't a good education for someone that would end up being Queen of England, but it was good enough. And so she had a very nice life when she grew up. She lived in the palace. She got this education. Um, she was very close to everyone in her family. She was especially close to her brother Teodosio and her sister Joanne. And she grew up in a very loving household.
Obviously, as you were saying, Catherine had quite a stable childhood. You hear of all these royal women and how there's some upheaval in their life growing up, but Catherine seems to have grown up in a stable, loving family environment.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And even it translated over to when she was queen because she ended up being very close to Charles's family too.
When was it decided that Catherine would marry Charles II?
There were actually talks with King Charles I of England about the Prince of Wales marrying a princess of Portugal. At that time, it was either Catherine or her sister Joanne. So that was in like 1642. And the reason for this was that King Charles I he was the first European monarch to recognize the new Braganza dynasty in Portugal. So they were very grateful to him for that. So then what happened was King Charles, was taken off the throne and beheaded in 1649. And so then it was Oliver Cromwell. So the talks kind of got stalled. But then once Charles II was restored in 1660, the negotiations heated up because he was very interested in the 2 million cruzados that Queen Louisa was offering him as a dowry. He needed money at that time. So that's when things heated up. And then the contract for the marriage was in 1662.
Do we know when Catherine met Charles for the first time, and do we know how their first meeting went?
Yes, we do know. This is very interesting because there were huge celebrations in Lisbon for Catherine's departure. They had parades and masses were said in the cathedral, and they had music on the water. And she got on the Royal Charles, which was the ship that took her to England. And she had a pretty safe voyage, actually, and she ended up in Portsmouth. And Charles's brother, James, the Duke of York, was waiting for her. And so when she arrived, he's the one that actually greeted her. He was the first one to greet her. Charles was in London with parliamentary matters and with his mistress, Arbor Villiers. So it was about a week before Catherine actually met Charles, but he did finally arrive. By that time, Catherine was ill. And so she was on her ship in her bed, and Charles met her there. That was very interesting. So Um, and the meeting went very well. I think that Charles liked her. He liked her eyes and he liked her demeanor. And And she was in love with him even before they got married. So that worked out really well.
When were they married? When was they officially married?
They were married just shortly after they met. And Catherine insisted on a Catholic rite for the marriage because she was Catholic. Of course, Charles was Protestant. So they had a secret marriage in her bedroom. And then a day or two later, there was no chapel in Portsmouth because the chapel had been destroyed during the Civil War. So they kind of made up this little place where they went to the governor's house and they had a room, the hall in there. They put two thrones and a canopy up. It was kind of an interesting wedding ceremony. I've never seen one like this. They read the marriage treaty, and then Catherine assented to that, and she assented to the marriage, and that was it. They were married. So I've never seen a marriage like that before, a royal marriage like that.
Was Catherine a popular bride? Obviously, Catherine's now mother-in-law, Henrietta Maria, was not a popular choice of Queen Consort. Was it any different for Catherine?
No, it wasn't. um, first of all, she was Portuguese, and she's the only Portuguese queen of England. So that was kind of interesting. And then, of course, she was Catholic, and the people did not want Charles to marry a Catholic. But he didn't really have a choice. There weren't a lot of Protestant brides available to him at that time. So, and Henrietta Maria was kind of instrumental in Charles marrying a Catholic. She wanted him to marry a Catholic. And kind of the difference between Henrietta Maria and Catherine is Henrietta Maria was kind of brought up to with the mission of, converting the English to Catholicism. Catherine would have loved that, but she wasn't overt about it. She didn't, make that her plan.
Do do we know how Catherine, felt or how she dealt with Charles's many mistresses and adulteries? Because obviously that is what Charles II is infamous for.
Yes. Catherine was very hurt by that because she loved Charles and she was very loyal to him, and she would have felt like that he betrayed her, definitely. But I think that Henrietta Maria was kind of instrumental in telling her, you know, this is the way it is. You're just going to have to learn to deal with it. You need to concentrate on having a child because that would cement your position at court, if you did that. And so Catherine had the wherewithal to make a decision to just overcome that and just love Charles as she loved him and, deal with it like that. But there is some historical record that she yelled at Charles. She had a temper, so she would yell at Charles and be upset about the way she was treated by the mistresses. That's for sure.
What was Catherine like as a queen? What was she patron of, and kind of what does she try to stand for as her time as queen?
Yes, this is what I really loved about her is that she did have agency as a queen. Um, and it's just not, you just don't hear about it. But like one of the things she did is she brought a full set of Portuguese musicians with her to court. And most of the time they worked in her chapel, but she did have them perform at court sometimes. And she was also known for her patronage of Italian music. And this was very important. I mean, she was the most, prominent patron of Italian music. And she also brought in some Catholic painters like Jacob Huysman from uh, Flanders and Benedetto Gennari from Italy, and they would paint portraits of her and other people in the court. They also decorated her chapels. So she did have agency. Another thing she did was, and this was an imitation of her mother-in-law, she would hold circles in the evening at court in her rooms. And so everybody at court, anybody could come. As long as you were dressed properly, you could come. And the king would come, the Duke of York, some of the ministers, they would all hang out in the rooms. They would gossip, talk politics. She would have card playing, she would have music. So this was really significant for her and a way for her to engage in politics without actually being political.
Do we know if Catherine was ever pregnant? And when she wasn't pregnant, did this increase pressure in the marriage for Charles to separate from their marriage?
That's an excellent question, Jess, because um, she did everything in her power to get pregnant. She went to the baths, she went on pilgrimages, she prayed, she consulted with the doctors. And we do have evidence that she was pregnant and she did have a miscarriage. This is in the doctor's uh, record. And we also have a mention a couple of times where Charles wrote to his sister Henrietta, known as Minette in France, and he mentioned that Catherine was pregnant a couple of times. So I believe she was pregnant at least once and possibly as many as three times. So this rumor that she, couldn't get pregnant is not true. She did. But what it did for their relationship is really interesting because Charles, he saw how hard she worked to get pregnant. And this was, significant for him. And he never ever considered divorcing her because of that.
I I think it says a lot of Charles to stand by Catherine because obviously at this time in history, it's still the blame is with the woman that she's not getting pregnant, she's not fulfilling her role. And I think for all of Charles's many faults, he did do a service to Catherine here because I think this helps her a lot as well.
It did. It did. He also had to think about politics, though. He did not want to offend the King of Portugal. But even with that, I think that you're right. I give him a lot of credit for standing by her.
Was Catherine very active in court life? Did she ever involve herself in politics?
The only thing she overtly did was she had an anti-French policy. She did not want France to, have anything to do with England. However, Charles was, you know, he was very close to Louis the 14th and his sister, and he did have a treaty with Louis the 14th. But I think part of her anti-Frenchness was against Louise de Keroualle, the Duchess of Portsmouth, who was the last great mistress of King Charles. She was French. And so she wanted to like counteract her influence a little bit. And she always had Portugal first in her mind. So she did everything she could to help Portugal when she was in England.
Once Catherine is kind of more established as queen, and obviously she's been queen for a long time, does her popularity rise in England, after seeing how well she is at Queen Consort?
Yes, yes. And this is very important because of the Popish plot. I know you've heard of the Popish plot. And this is where Titus Oates came up with this fake rumor that the Jesuits were trying to rise up and kill King Charles and put his brother James on the throne because James had converted to Catholicism. And so what happened was everybody, especially in Parliament, the nobles and others that knew Catherine personally, knew how loyal she was to the king and knew that she would never kill the king. So that kind of saved her in the end because, they would not give the rumors any importance. And also Charles stood by her, even so.
By 1685, Charles II is dying. Do we know if Catherine was with Charles on his deathbed?
Yes, she was there, but she had to leave. And she did come back, but she was not there when he actually died. And also, Charles converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. And we don't really know who exactly talked him into that, but Catherine could have had something to do with that, along with his brother and some others.
Do we know how upset Catherine was over Charles's death?
He was extremely depressed, very depressed. Yes, that was one of the seminal points in her life.
Did Catherine stay in England as a widow after Charles's death and the accession of James II?
Yes, she did. Now, when James was king, she got along very well with James and his wife, Mary Beatrice. So she was kind of happy. That was probably the happiest years for her in England. However, she still did try to return to Portugal. How it didn't work out. She almost got away, but it didn't work out. But then when William and Mary came to the throne, she had a very hard time. For some reason, Queen Mary did not like Catherine. They did not get along. I think Mary felt like she had Jacobite sympathies because she was good friends with James. And so Catherine went into another gear and worked on her brother and worked on King William to get ships to go back to Portugal. So she was there from 1685 to 1692. And then she finally took the journey back to Portugal.
There's a rumor that in her widowhood she remarries. Is there any truth in this at all?
None whatsoever. None. She would never, ever, she would have never been unfaithful to Charles and she would have never remarried. But this comes from there was a man that worked in her household, uh, Louis Duras, Lord Feversham, and they were very close. When they would play cards, she loved to play cards and she gambled too. Um, Feversham would be the banker for the gambling. And actually, King William put him in the Tower of London because he was, he had Jacobite sympathies, of course. And Catherine said, I can't play cards because I don't have my banker to keep the bank. And William said, okay, well, I'll let him go. But I think this comes from there was a lot of rumors. And then the daughter of Mary Beatrice asked her mother one time, did Catherine have a lover? And Mary Beatrice said, no, she didn't. But that's where that comes from.
Could you tell us about Catherine's time when she goes back to Portugal? How does she spend her time back in her homeland?
At first, I feel like Catherine was very unsettled. Um, she didn't know where to go, where to live, what her role was at court. She traveled to different homes and stayed with different nobles. And eventually, she always had a dream, I think, to build a palace that was kind of a farm, like in a countryside, maybe like Via Vicosa was when she was a young child. And so she did buy some land and build a palace there, Bemposta Palace. Part of it is still there. The chapel is still there. The earthquake destroyed most of it, though, in 1755. But she did build this palace. And then her brother, they were very close. Her brother, the king, was very close with her. And the Portuguese historian Malin Newitt believes that Pedro did everything that he did to make his sister happy. So I thought that was a very interesting comment. But they got involved in the War of the Spanish Succession, and Catherine convinced him to go in on the side of the Allies, which included England. And so he had to go off and fight in the war. And he named Catherine as his regent while he was gone. So she handled affairs of the government for several months while he was gone. And she did this very well. She was very good. She was diligent. She made sure the troops had food and horses and arms and, whatever was needed. And she did this with the help of a council made up of men that didn't really want to work with a woman. So she had to maneuver through all that. Then her brother came back, but then he suffered a stroke. And so he named her regent again. And so she was sick. She ended up getting sick, and then he had to come back and take over again. But so she really you know, did her duties quite well as regent.
I mean, this is such a different image of Catherine, isn't it? Because obviously, as we've been saying, she's kind of made us docile, kind of fades into the background. But she was regent of a quite a powerful country, and like she was good at it. She was really good at it.
Yes, I wish people could learn this about her.
Could you tell us when Catherine died, and do we know how she died?
We do. So she was running the country, and this was in December of 1705. And she got sick. It was described as a colic, which is some kind of stomach issue. And she was in terrible pain. Her brother came. He didn't want to see her, but he did, and it was kind of a sad meeting. But and then she died in her palace of Imposta in Lisbon. Um, the funeral took place pretty quickly, and it was a very splendid funeral. Um, they had a procession through Lisbon. They buried her in the chapel of the Hieronymus Monastery in Lisbon. And then in the 19th century, the government uh, reinterred her and several other of her family members in the monastery of St. Vincent de Fora in Lisbon. So that's where she's buried now, and it's the mausoleum of the Braganza dynasty. So there's many other Braganza kings buried there with her.
And you go and visit where she's buried today.
Yes, you can go to St. Vincent and see her. Her remains are in a drawer along with some other ones, and there's a crown on top of where she's buried.
I like to ask all of my guests this. What legacy has Catherine left? What is her mark in history?
This is the entire point of my book that I've written about her. Um, because what happened was in her marriage treaty, yes, Charles got 2 million cruzados, but also the cities of Tangier and Bombay were also included in that because the Portuguese had colonized these two cities. But it was getting too expensive to keep them up. So they traded those in with her treaty. And Charles did try to keep Tangier for a while, but it ended up being too expensive and too much trouble. So he ended up blowing up the whole place. But Bombay, he sold or leased to the English East India Company. And they used Bombay as sort of the home base for their trading company. They also used it as their home base to take over the Empire of India. But the most important thing is the objects that came from this trade from Bombay. Catherine brought with her to England some lacquer cabinets. The diarist John Evelyn noticed these cabinets in his diary when he went to see her at Hampton Court. And these are the black cabinets with the etchings on them, the beautiful Chinese etchings. And they had little hooks that you could open the doors and close the doors. Another thing is porcelain. They brought a lot of porcelain from China and Bombay to England. Another thing is hain or rattan, which was a reed that could be woven. And if you think about the chairs before cane came to England, they were all kind of boxy and square and heavy, made of oak or walnut. And once they got cane, they would weave the seats and the backs of the chairs with the cane. And this made the chairs lighter and easier to move. After the Great Fire of London, many people lost their furniture. And so these chairs started to be made kind of on an assembly line and sold. Many of them were sold. Another thing is cotton fabric that was woven in India by hand. Sometimes it would have um, gold thread in it or whatever. That was really important. There was, a lot of think about linens, clothing, napkins, all that stuff uh, was brought. And of course, tea. So Agnes Strickland wrote in her biography of Catherine that she introduced tea to England. Of course, this isn't true. Tea had been in England, we know, since 1620. But it was mostly used for medicinal purposes because it was very expensive and only rich people could buy it. But what Catherine and some other women at court did was they started to drink it socially. And so they made that popular. Catherine and many others made that popular. But that's her legacy, is those different items that came into English life.
Yes, I think as you so well said that there's so much more to Catherine than meets the eye, and I will leave a link in the show notes when this episode is released for people to go purchase your book and learn much more about Catherine and learn the real Catherine as well.
Hmm. That was my whole mission, was to get the real Catherine out there.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests five fun history questions. So,
Hmm.
firstly, have you got a historical pet peeve?
I do. Um, I don't like it when some of these historical myths get perpetuated. And one of my best examples is that somewhere along the line it was written down that Henry VIII had 72,000 people killed. And this is just ridiculous. And there's been many historians over the years that have tried to debunk this myth. But if you just like think of the numbers, the population of England at that time was 2.8 million, and 72,000 people would be 2.6% of the population. And so that would average out to about 2,000 executions a year. The executioners would have had to have worked 7 days a week, killing 5 or 6 people a day. It's just, it's just not possible. So that's my pet peeve, is when things like that get perpetuated all the time.
I know Henry liked to kill people, but I don't think he managed that many in his lifetime.
Exactly.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because I like to bring attention to some women in history that I don't think people know about for whatever reason. And in my research for my second book, I came across a woman named Catherine of Burgundy. She was the daughter of Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. She married the Duke of Austria, and she never had any children, and her husband died pretty soon after she got married. But she was named, her husband named her the Countess of Ferret. And so she actually ruled Ferret on her own. Um, it's kind of unusual to see a woman that can rule like this and, have her own agency. She did help her brother and her father and her brother, as a diplomat and things like that. But she's just a fascinating character, and she made a marriage without her brother's permission. You just don't see this happen very often with aristocratic women. And so I think she was really bold and charismatic. And I just wanted to mention another woman that I really appreciate, and that is Anne de Beaujeu. She was the daughter of King Louis the 11th of France, and she ruled France for her brother for several years. I mean, she was basically Queen of France. Of course, she didn't get credited with that, and she did a terrific job. So I would invite those two women to my dinner party.
Have you got a favorite historical book? It can be in fiction, non-fiction, or both.
Well, I had to think about this, and I've read so many books, and I love books, but I'm just going to say right now, I've just recently finished Agnes Strickland's biography of Mary Beatrice. d'Este, the Queen of James II. And it's just a masterpiece, a real masterpiece. She basically tells you what happened almost every day in this woman's life. And you just don't see this, in biographies very often. Of course, it's 672 pages, so she had she she really got into a lot of detail, but it's quite interesting. And I also think that Mary Beatrice is another forgotten queen, and she was really a magnificent woman.
If you could go back to any event or day in history, when and where would it be and why?
Oh, this is a great question because I came up with a really good one. Um, there was a conference that was held in Cambrai in August of 1529, and two powerful women, Louise of Savoy, who was the mother of King Francis I, and Margaret of Austria, who was the regent of the Netherlands for Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, met in Cambrai to iron out a treaty, which ended up being the Peace of Cambrai or the Ladies' Peace. Um, Charles V had captured Francis I at the during a battle and kept him prisoner. And to get released, Charles had to promise his two sons as hostages. And so this treaty was to get the hostages released, along with some other things, especially Burgundy. Francis had to surrender Burgundy to Charles, but he never did. He never did give it to him. But anyway, it would have been a really spectacular place to be. There was a lot of celebrations. Um, it was a contentious conference, very contentious, but they did finally come up with a peace. And so it would have been fun to watch those two women in action.
No, I agree. I've heard about that and I think it's so incredible. I think, can you just imagine these two women just battling it out and it's just so incredible.
Yes, yes. And it was hot, and Margaret's leg was bothering her, and she just powered through it, you know. And Louise was fairly old at that time and not well, but they did it.
And finally, have you got a favorite historical fact?
I do. Anne of Cleves was not ugly. You can see from that painting by Hans Holbein, she was quite attractive. But what happened was, Thomas Cromwell got this treaty, marriage treaty, and he promised to go to war if Cleves ever wanted to go to war. And Anna's brother decided to pick a fight with Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And, and Henry did not want to go to war with Charles V. So that's why he ended up divorcing Anne of Cleves. And part of that was to come up with this propaganda that Henry wasn't attracted to Anne, that she was ugly, that he could not have sex with her, that kind of thing. This propaganda has lasted for 500 years. So I think people need to reassess that.
No, I agree. I was saying to someone, I think last week, the reason why Anne of Cleves is called ugly is because she took one look at Henry and showed true disgust at what was in front of her. She didn't have enough time to mask the, oh God, you know.
Exactly.
But anyone that's listening, Anne of Cleves was not ugly. She was actually pretty good looking.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on today and telling us Catherine's story. It's been honestly wonderful.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to get the word out.
Thank you for listening to her story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.